The other day I'm having a conversation with a colleague, and the subject of employee ownership comes up. Before I can even get a word in, this colleague of mine interjects with, "It's already been tried. It was called Saturn, and it failed." Without knowing much about what he was referring to, I simply pointed out the obvious, which is that typical capitalist enterprises fail all the time. And no one says, "Look, capitalism is a colossal failure because of it." Okay, maybe some people do. Unfortunately, the convo was cut short, but despite the fact that I knew very little about Saturn, I would soon learn that my comment was much more relevant than I had previously realized.
What made Saturn completely different from its competitors was the ownership structure between management, engineers, and the factory workers. In other GM brands like Chevrolet and Pontiac, the management would tell the engineers what to build, the engineers would drop the design, and the factory would build the bureaucracy-approved product without giving any input on what they were making. But at Saturn, the dynamic would be a little different and had the potential to change the auto industry forever. Major decisions at car companies are usually made from the top down, but at Saturn, the United Auto Workers Union now had a huge input on their car's design, meaning that people working on the factory floor could tell the engineers and management what would and wouldn't work. This shared ownership of Saturn between everyone involved had an interesting effect on the workplace culture. It turns out if you listen to your employees and make them feel like their voices matter, they give you their loyalty and productivity increases. By the end of 1995, Saturn had built over 1 million cars in its short 6-year history. But the good times wouldn't last forever. While the S-Line was updated 3 times during its life, there was no escaping the fact that Saturn only really had 1 car to sell. This stagnation, combined with the fact that the new company's shine had worn away, meant that Saturn sales were slowing down. While new cars were needed, GM was a bit strapped for cash and couldn't afford to design a totally new, unique vehicle for Saturn, like the S-Series. In fact, GM would never be able to design a unique Saturn again, making the S-Series a bit of a unicorn. GM had created Saturn to operate in a way that wasn't like GM, but now General Motors was forcing Saturn to act like General Motors. Saturn had always been the oddball in GM's lineup, and while its employees were happy and customers loyal, neither of those things meant new sales, and that meant no new money coming in. GM had yet to get a return on their investment in Saturn. They had spent nearly $5 billion on development and the Spring Hill facility. Since GM was a little light in the wallet, that meant Saturn was in the crosshairs of cost cutters. If Saturn didn't start making money soon, it would mean bad news. Despite introducing 3 new vehicles for the new millennium, Saturn remained a fairly small fry in the industry. Their promise of a haggle-free experience still proved to be attractive. However, the market was no longer theirs alone, as Toyota had introduced Scion and their no-haggle price models in 2003. This competition, combined with a steadily worsening economic situation, would combine to hit Saturn hard. Very hard. By 2005, Saturn was in chaos.
This is fine.
Unable to make any money on its own. Competition within and without GM was stifling the now stale brand. The company was out of options and completely resigned itself to selling a lineup of all rebadged vehicles. Nothing could save Saturn, as the economic recession that struck the US in 2008 created a dire situation at GM. To save General Motors, the government provided assistance in the form of the now famous bailout package, on the condition that the plethora of companies GM owned and sold cars under be pared down. So how did it get so bad? A 2010 lawsuit found that Saturn's vice president and general manager, Jill Laziak, didn't know whether or not Saturn was making money. She said that in a deposition, under oath, to a lawyer, and she wasn't the only one. Their CFO, Edward Tupper-Zicki, said he didn't know Saturn's financial condition while he was involved with the company. He's the CFO. Financial is in his title.
Well, that's not good.
So in 2010, 3 GM companies, Pontiac, Hummer, and Saturn, all closed their doors, producing their last car, probably for good. While General Motors ended up surviving the recession, their grand experiment in a new kind of car company, which they called Saturn, did not. I think Saturn could have been great if GM had let them stay true to their mission. They created Saturn to be a new kind of company, and at the start, they were. What doomed this company that GM created to run differently was that GM ran it like GM.
So in short, it wasn't employee ownership that failed, but it was the decisions of General Motors, i.e. capitalism, that proved to be unsustainable. Now, perhaps this is a poor example. Okay, it's a terrible example, because Saturn was ultimately owned and controlled by its parent company. But it does highlight common misconceptions about social enterprise as a whole. Namely that 1. Social enterprises are uncommon and have few successful examples to draw conclusions from, and 2. Social enterprise is unworkable, uncompetitive, and ultimately doomed to fail. This couldn't be further from the truth. The fact is that approximately 32 million Americans own stock through employee stock ownership plans, along with stock options, stock purchase plans, and 401k plans, and 10 million Americans work at employee-owned companies, and another 130 million Americans own democratized wealth. So obviously, employee ownership and workplace democracy are workable and at least competitive enough to survive. But I've heard similar arguments made about cooperatives too, that if one fails, it must mean the entire model is unworkable and bound to fail. Again, this couldn't be further from the truth. As it just so happens, much of the research done on the subject rules in favor of cooperatives. A number of national case studies have shown that cooperatives tend to have a longer life than other types of enterprise, and therefore a higher level of entrepreneurial sustainability. A survey conducted by the Canadian government found that the rate of survival of cooperatives after 3 years was 75%, whereas it was only 48% for all enterprises put together, and that after 10 years, 44% of cooperatives were still in operation, whereas the ratio was only 20% for all enterprises. Co-ops have proven to be exceptionally resilient in times of economic crisis, primarily due to more steady and stable mechanisms for creating wealth for greater numbers of people. For example, cooperative banks build up counter-cyclical buffers that function well in case of a crisis, and are less likely to lead members and clients towards a debt trap. Housing cooperatives, whether organized around home rental or ownership, considerably contribute to avoiding housing bubbles, such as that of the subprime in the United States, that was a major source of the 2007 through 2012 global economic crisis. Housing crises have been weaker or non-existent in countries where the housing cooperative system is particularly strong, such as in Norway or Germany. Democratic checks and balances, if properly managed, have proven not to be a cost but a long-term strategic investment. When faced with consistent boom and bust cycles, government shutdowns, and a diminishing labor movement, average working Americans need practical solutions that not only put more income in their pocket, but also provide them with the opportunity to play an active role in the decisions made by economic institutions that directly affect their lives. In essence, social enterprise doesn't subvert markets. In fact, not only do they make markets more efficient and resilient, especially when faced with economic crisis, but they ultimately make markets more free by encouraging maximum participation and a sense of ownership and responsibility, as Father Fulton J. Sheen would say. So next time you hear scoffing remarks made about social enterprise, use the tools I've given you. Go forth and pwn your opponent. I'm Social Capital. If you liked the video, you know the routine. Peace.